Have you ever witnessed nature's most unlikely hero emerge from the shadows of tragedy? When a magnificent lion encountered a giant python crushing a helpless baby rhino, every safari guide expected the apex predator to simply walk away. It wasn't his fight, wasn't his prey. But what this lion did next defied every law of the wild and left an entire safari group absolutely speechless, forever changing how we understand courage, compassion, and the invisible bonds that connect all life. The Mkomazi Game Reserve stretches across the rolling hills of northern Tanzania like a living tapestry.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you.
Where ancient acacia woodlands give way to open grasslands dotted with massive baobab trees that have witnessed centuries of wildlife drama. This lesser-known sanctuary, bordering Kenya's Tsavo National Park, represents one of East Africa's most successful conservation stories, where black rhinos have been reintroduced after decades of absence, creating a unique ecosystem where endangered species coexist with traditional predators in carefully managed harmony. Scattered kopjes, rocky outcrops that rise from the savanna like natural fortresses, provide elevated vantage points where lions survey their territories, while offering refuge for smaller creatures seeking escape from the harsh equatorial sun. The reserve's diverse topography creates microclimates, where dense riverine forests shelter pythons and other reptiles, while open plains provide ideal hunting grounds for the big cats that rule this ancient landscape. This isn't your typical safari story about predator-prey relationships or the circle of life playing out in nature's theater. What you're about to witness transcends every assumption about territorial behavior, species loyalty, and the capacity for moral decision-making in the animal kingdom. It's not about hunting instincts or survival of the fittest. It's about the shocking moment when conscience proves stronger than millions of years of evolutionary programming that should have kept species forever divided by their roles as hunter and hunted. The reserve's conservation success has created scenarios where extremely rare species like black rhinos share habitat with apex predators, forcing interactions that would have been impossible during the decades when rhino populations had been decimated by poaching. These encounters, while carefully monitored by research teams, have produced wildlife behaviors that challenge fundamental assumptions about territorial boundaries and species recognition. On this particular morning, as safari vehicles positioned themselves for the day's first game drive, and the African sun climbed above the acacia canopies, destiny was preparing to showcase an act of courage so extraordinary that it would leave an entire group of international tourists and experienced guides questioning everything they thought they knew about the capacity for heroism in the natural world. In the heart of Mkomazi's acacia woodlands lived Mfalme, a magnificent 8-year-old male lion whose distinctive black mane and battle-scarred face told stories of countless territorial disputes and successful hunts. Unlike most solitary males, Mfalme had earned his territory through intelligence rather than brute force, his strategic approach to survival making him one of the reserve's most respected predators. His amber eyes held depths of experience that spoke to years of reading the subtle dynamics of his domain, while his powerful frame moved with the confident grace of a ruler who understood that true strength lay in wisdom rather than violence. What made Mfalme extraordinary wasn't just his physical prowess, but his documented history of unusual behaviors that had fascinated wildlife researchers. Unlike typical lions who followed predictable hunting patterns, he had been observed making decisions that seemed to consider broader ecosystem impacts, suggesting cognitive abilities that bordered on environmental awareness. Several kilometers away, in the dense riverine forest where massive python tracks had been discovered by conservation teams, lurked an ancient predator whose presence in the reserve represented both wonder and danger. The giant African rock python that ruled these shadows was estimated to be over 30 feet in length, a primordial monster whose girth spoke to decades of successful hunting in an environment where only the most perfectly adapted survived. But the most precious resident of Mkomazi's reintroduction program was little Hodari, a 6-month-old black rhino calf whose survival represented hope for an entire species teetering on the edge of extinction. Born to Shuja, one of the reserve's founding female rhinos, Hodari's distinctive horn was just beginning to develop, while his gray hide bore the healthy shine that spoke to excellent maternal care and abundant nutrition. His bright eyes sparkled with the kind of innocent wonder that made him beloved by conservation staff, though his tendency to wander beyond his mother's protective reach created constant anxiety among those responsible for his welfare in a landscape where danger could emerge from any shadow. The first warning came as a subtle shift in Mkomazi's morning chorus that Mfalme's predatory instincts detected from his resting place beneath a massive baobab tree. The lion had been peacefully surveying his territory when the familiar symphony of bird calls and insect sounds began to fragment in a pattern he had learned to associate with the movement of large predators through the reserve's diverse ecosystems. Mfalme's massive head lifted from his morning grooming, his battle-scarred ears rotating to pinpoint the source of disturbance that had triggered this widespread alarm among the smaller creatures. His years of ruling this territory had taught him to distinguish between the environmental changes caused by grazing herbivores and the more ominous shifts that announced the presence of hunting predators moving through areas where they typically avoided daylight exposure. The lion's keen senses detected something that shouldn't have been present in the open woodland areas where rhinos and other herbivores felt safe during the cooler morning hours. His nostrils flared as he tested the air for scents that carried information about threats his domain had trained him to recognize, but what reached him was the distinctive musk of python, a smell that belonged in the dense riverine forests, not in the acacia groves where vulnerable young animals came to feed. Meanwhile, several hundred meters away, little Hodari's innocent exploration had led him beyond the protective oversight of his mother Shuja, who was engaged in her own foraging activities. The young rhino's natural curiosity about a cluster of interesting butterflies had drawn him toward the edge of the woodland where denser vegetation provided perfect concealment for predators that preferred ambush tactics over open confrontation. From the safari vehicles positioned strategically throughout the reserve, experienced guides began noticing the same environmental cues that had alerted Mfalme to approaching danger. Their trained eyes detected the subtle changes in wildlife behavior that preceded dramatic encounters, while their radio communications crackled to life as they prepared to document what their instincts told them would be a significant predator-prey interaction. The stage was being set for an encounter that would test every assumption about the boundaries between territorial observation and moral intervention in the wild.
What erupted from the dense undergrowth was a nightmare of coiled muscle and predatory power that transformed the peaceful morning into a scene from humanity's darkest fears about the African wilderness. The massive python that emerged from its concealment was a primordial monster 30 feet in length, its diamond-patterned scales glistening in the dappled sunlight as it moved with the fluid grace that made these serpents the stuff of legend among safari guides and wildlife researchers. The attack unfolded with devastating speed that demonstrated millions of years of evolutionary perfection in ambush predation. Little Hodari, caught completely off guard while investigating a colorful cluster of wildflowers, had no time to react before powerful coils wrapped around his small form with the inexorable force of a living vice. The young rhino's trumpet of terror pierced the morning air, a sound so heartbreaking it seemed to shatter the very soul of the ancient woodland. The python's strategy revealed the intelligence that made these serpents among Africa's most formidable predators. Instead of attempting to constrict in the open where adult rhinos might intervene, the massive snake began dragging little Hodari toward the dense thicket where its killing chamber had been prepared.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Each loop of the serpent's body was positioned with surgical precision, applying pressure to vital points while maintaining the perfect grip that would allow it to transport its prize to safety. From the safari vehicles positioned throughout the reserve, international tourists and experienced guides watched in horrified fascination as one of conservation's greatest success stories became a victim of nature's most brutal realities. Their cameras captured every moment of the unfolding tragedy, but their presence as observers rather than participants highlighted the cruel irony of wildlife photography. They could document, but not intervene in the ancient dramas that shaped ecosystem dynamics. But it was Mkomazi's response that would soon transform this tragedy into something that challenged every assumption about territorial behavior and moral reasoning in apex predators. The lion's approach to the python attack would reveal depths of consciousness that redefined scientific understanding of animal decision-making under extreme moral pressure.
Mkomazi's response to witnessing little Hodari's mortal peril revealed the complex internal battle raging within even the most apex of predators when confronted with innocent suffering. The lion's initial reaction followed predictable territorial protocols. This wasn't his prey, wasn't his family. An intervention would expose him to unnecessary danger from one of Africa's most formidable serpents. His amber eyes tracked the python's movements with the analytical precision of a hunter assessing potential competition rather than a moral agent considering rescue. Yet something in Hodari's cries seemed to penetrate deeper layers of Mkomazi's consciousness than simple territorial calculation could reach. The young rhino's terror carried frequencies that spoke the universal language of helpless innocence under attack, triggering responses that transcended the typical predator-prey dynamics that governed most wildlife interactions. The lion's massive frame tensed as conflicting instincts warred within him, the pragmatic survival programming that demanded non-intervention versus something far more complex that seemed to recognize moral obligation. From the safari vehicles, an international group of tourists and their experienced guide, Captain David Mwangi, watched this unprecedented drama unfold with growing amazement. Their expectations had been set by countless nature documentaries, showing lions as opportunistic predators who would either ignore such encounters or potentially exploit the python's distraction to claim territory. None of their previous African experiences had prepared them for what they were witnessing. The guide's whispered commentary into his radio revealed his own confusion as Mkomazi's behavior began defying every pattern documented in wildlife research. Lions simply didn't involve themselves in conflicts between pythons and rhinos. The risk-reward calculation made no evolutionary sense. Yet the magnificent predator was clearly engaged in some form of decision-making process that went far beyond typical territorial assessment. Most remarkably, other wildlife throughout the area seemed to be responding to the crisis with their own forms of recognition and concern. Various antelope species that had fled at the first sign of python activity now gathered at safe distances, their body language suggesting they were bearing witness to something unprecedented rather than simply avoiding danger. The entire ecosystem appeared to understand that they were observing a moment when natural law might be challenged by something far more profound.
Mkomazi's decision to intervene came not from heroic impulse, but from something far more complex that challenged every assumption about moral reasoning in apex predators. The lion began his approach to the python encounter with movements that spoke to calculated assessment rather than territorial aggression. his strategic mind evaluating angles of attack, escape routes, and the tactical advantages he might possess against a serpent whose length exceeded his own body by a factor of 4. What made Mfalme's intervention extraordinary was his apparent understanding of the physics involved in confronting a constricting predator. Instead of the direct assault that might be expected from a territorial male, the lion positioned himself to exploit the python's greatest vulnerability, its inability to defend against attacks while maintaining its killing grip on prey. His approach revealed tactical thinking that went far beyond instinctual behavior. From the safari vehicles, Captain Mwangi's radio crackled to life as he provided real-time commentary to other guides positioned throughout the reserve. His voice carried the amazement of someone witnessing behavior that challenged 3 decades of African wildlife experience. The tourists in his vehicle sat in stunned silence, their cameras capturing what would soon become some of the most extraordinary wildlife footage ever recorded. But Mfalme's intervention was about to trigger responses throughout the ecosystem that would shock everyone present. From various positions around the woodland clearing, other predators began emerging to observe this unprecedented challenge to natural law. A leopard that had been hunting in nearby trees abandoned its stalk to witness the confrontation, while a family of African wild dogs positioned themselves as spectators rather than opportunists. Most remarkably, Hudari's mother, Shuja, had detected her calf's distress and was approaching the scene with the thunderous determination of 2 tons of maternal fury. The adult rhinos charged toward the python encounter would create a convergence of Africa's most powerful species that defied every rule of territorial behavior and predator avoidance. The stage was set for a multi-species confrontation that would redefine everything wildlife researchers thought they knew about cooperation, territorial boundaries, and the capacity for moral recognition among creatures supposedly governed only by survival instinct.
Mfalme's assault on the python was a masterclass in tactical precision that left every safari observer speechless with amazement. The lion's approach revealed strategic thinking that bordered on military genius. Instead of attacking the serpent's heavily muscled midsection, where his claws might prove ineffective, he targeted the python's head with lightning strikes designed to disrupt its neural control over the constricting coils that were slowly crushing little Hodari. The battle that followed challenged every assumption about interspecies conflict dynamics in the African wilderness. Mfalme's powerful jaws found purchase behind the python's skull, his fangs seeking the pressure points that would force the serpent to release its death grip. His understanding of anatomy, developed through years of successful hunting, now served him in the most unlikely application imaginable, not to kill prey, but to save it. The python's response revealed why these serpents had ruled African waterways and forests for millions of years. The massive snake attempted to incorporate Mfalme into its constricting embrace, seeking to crush both lion and rhino simultaneously. But the lion had anticipated this defensive strategy, using his superior mobility to maintain positions where the python's coils couldn't effectively encircle him. What transformed this rescue from individual heroism into something truly shocking was the arrival of additional participants. Shuja's thunderous charge toward the python encounter brought 2 tons of maternal fury into the equation, her massive horn aimed directly at the serpent's vulnerable midsection. The adult rhino's arrival created a coordinated assault that the python's evolutionary experience had never prepared it to counter. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of this multi-species intervention was the behavior of the other predators who had gathered to observe. Instead of exploiting the chaos for their own hunting opportunities, the leopard and wild dog family positioned themselves in what could only be described as a supportive formation, their presence adding psychological pressure that seemed designed to encourage the rescue rather than complicate it. From the safari vehicles, international tourists watched in absolute amazement as Africa's most iconic species united against a common threat in ways that redefined everything they thought they knew about the natural world.
The convergence of lion, rhino, and python created a battle that challenged every law of nature ever documented in wildlife research. Mfalme's precision strikes at the serpent's neural control centers, combined with Shuja's devastating charges that threatened to puncture the python's vital organs, created a coordinated assault that defied every assumption about interspecies cooperation under extreme circumstances. The python, faced with this unprecedented alliance between natural enemies, found its survival strategies completely overwhelmed by scenarios its evolutionary programming had never encountered. The massive serpent's attempt to maintain its killing grip on little Hodari while simultaneously defending against attacks from multiple directions revealed the limitations of even apex predators when confronted with coordinated opposition that transcended territorial boundaries. What happened next shocked everyone present beyond their capacity for rational explanation. As the python's grip began to weaken under the relentless assault, other wildlife throughout Mkomazi seemed to respond to some invisible signal that drew them toward the battle scene. Elephants trumpeted from distant valleys, their calls carrying across the reserve with frequencies that spoke to recognition of something historic occurring within their domain. The critical moment arrived when Mfalme managed to apply enough pressure to the python's skull to disrupt its neural control over the constricting coils. The serpent's grip on Hodari loosened just enough for the young rhino to draw his first full breath in several terrifying minutes, his weak calls of relief seeming to galvanize every participant in this extraordinary rescue. But it was the python's retreat that truly shocked the safari observers. Instead of the violent thrashing that might be expected from a cornered predator, the massive serpent began a calculated withdrawal that suggested recognition of defeat rather than mere tactical repositioning. The ancient predator's survival instincts, honed over decades of successful hunting, apparently recognized when persistence offered worse odds than strategic retreat. As the last coils released little Hodari, the young rhino stumbled toward his mother's protective embrace while Mfalme maintained his defensive position, ensuring the python's complete departure. The safari vehicles erupted in amazed commentary as tourists and guides struggled to process what they had witnessed, a coordinated rescue that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness and moral reasoning.
The immediate aftermath of Hodari's rescue created a scene that challenged every protocol in wildlife observation ethics and redefined the relationship between human witness and animal heroism. As the young rhino recovered in his mother's protective embrace, Mfalme remained vigilant nearby, his presence serving as continued insurance against the python's potential return. The lion's post-rescue behavior suggested understanding that his intervention had created ongoing responsibility rather than completing a discrete action. What shocked the safari observers even more was the behavior of the other wildlife that had gathered during the crisis. Instead of dispersing once the immediate danger passed, various species seemed to be engaging in what could only be described as collective acknowledgement of what they had witnessed. Elephants continued their distant trumpeting, while antelope species maintained their observational positions, creating an audience for something they apparently recognized as historically significant. Captain Mwangi's radio communications with reserve headquarters carried the amazement of someone struggling to report behavior that challenged 3 decades of professional experience. His description of coordinated interspecies rescue efforts met with initial skepticism until other guides confirmed similar observations from their positions throughout Mkomazi. The most remarkable aspect of the encounter's resolution was the apparent recognition that passed between Tsavo and Mfalme. The adult rhino's approach to the lion who had saved her calf violated every rule of species interaction. Rhinos and lions maintain careful distance in normal circumstances. Yet Tsavo's body language suggested gratitude that transcended evolutionary programming, her massive head lowering in what appeared to be acknowledgement of debt. Little Hodari's recovery was swift, his resilient youth allowing him to overcome the trauma of his near-death experience. But the young rhino's behavior around Mfalme in subsequent weeks would provide ongoing evidence that animals possessed memory and recognition capabilities far beyond scientific assumptions. The safari tourists departed Mkomazi with footage and experiences that would challenge wildlife conservation philosophy for years to come, their cameras having captured proof that heroism, cooperation, and moral reasoning existed throughout the natural world in ways that redefined the boundaries between human and animal consciousness.
The story of Mfalme's heroic intervention became a cornerstone in wildlife behavior research, fundamentally challenging every assumption about moral reasoning and cooperative behavior in apex predators. Safari operators worldwide began restructuring their educational programs based on the Mkomazi incident, recognizing that animal consciousness and decision-making capabilities exceeded every boundary that science had previously established. The footage captured by tourists that morning became some of the most studied wildlife video in research history, frame-by-frame analysis revealing evidence of strategic planning, risk assessment, and moral reasoning that redefined understanding of animal intelligence. Mfalme's tactical approach to the python rescue demonstrated cognitive abilities that bordered on the extraordinary, while his ongoing protective relationship with Hodari proved that animal memory and gratitude operated on timescales far beyond simple conditioning. Wildlife conservation philosophy underwent revolutionary changes as the implications of interspecies cooperation became clear. The recognition that animals could make moral choices, form alliances across traditional boundaries, and demonstrate heroism in defense of other species inspired new approaches to habitat protection that emphasized the emotional and intellectual needs of wildlife rather than merely their physical survival requirements. Most profoundly, Mfalme's story reminded humanity that courage, compassion, and the recognition of innocent suffering were not uniquely human traits, but universal qualities that connected all conscious beings. His willingness to risk his life for a creature outside his own species demonstrated that heroism transcended every boundary that evolution had created, revealing invisible bonds that apparently linked all life in ways science was only beginning to understand. The Mkomazi Game Reserve continues to be home to this extraordinary community of wildlife, their daily interactions providing ongoing evidence that cooperation, gratitude, and moral reasoning exist throughout the natural world. Mfalme's legacy serves as a powerful reminder that heroism knows no species boundaries, and that the capacity for love, sacrifice, and recognition of nobility exists wherever consciousness takes root in the magnificent tapestry of life on Earth.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.